Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine standing on the edge of the Great Rift Valley, 70,000 years ago. The sun rises over the savanna, painting the acacia trees in gold. Somewhere in the distance, a group of humans, your ancestors, gather around a fire. They're not just surviving, they're innovating, creating, thinking. Now open your eyes, because what I'm about to tell you will shatter everything you thought you knew about human civilization. Subscribe to this channel as we dive deeper. For too long, we've been told that civilization began in Mesopotamia, that writing was invented in Sumer, that Africa was a dark continent waiting to be discovered. But here's the truth. Africa didn't need to be discovered. Africa is the discovery. It's where humanity itself was born, where we learned to think, to speak, to dream. And the civilizations that rose from its soil weren't just early, they were magnificent, complex, and in many ways more advanced than anything Europe would see for thousands of years. This is the story of how African civilization happened. Not the version you learned in school, but the real one. The one written in ancient stones, buried treasures, and the DNA of every human being alive today. Our story begins around 300,000 years ago in what is now Morocco. At Jebel Irhoud, anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, take their first breath. This is ground zero, patient zero for everything that follows. But let's jump forward to about 70,000 years ago, to Blombos Cave in what is now South Africa. Here, something extraordinary is happening. People are grinding ochre, a red mineral, into powder. They're mixing it with bone marrow and charcoal to create paint. They're carving geometric patterns into pieces of ochre, creating what may be the world's oldest known abstract art. They're making beads from seashells, drilling tiny holes with stone tools, creating jewelry. Think about that. While Neanderthals in Europe were still figuring out basic survival, Africans were creating art. They were thinking symbolically, expressing themselves, developing culture. And it gets better. Along the shores of ancient African lakes, people were fishing with sophisticated bone harpoons. In the Congo Basin, they were inventing complex languages. In the Kalahari, they were developing an encyclopedic knowledge of hundreds of plant species, which ones heal, which ones kill, which ones provide food in the harshest drought. Around 50,000 years ago, a small group of Africans decided to leave. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was necessity, but this group, probably no more than a few hundred people, walked out of Africa and eventually populated the entire planet. Every human outside of Africa today descends from these pioneers. We're all Africans in the end. But the real story isn't about who left, it's about what happened with those who stayed. Around 10,000 years ago, something changed. The Sahara wasn't a desert then, it was green, lush, covered in grasslands and dotted with massive lakes. People gathered along the Nile River, and they made a revolutionary discovery: agriculture. In the fertile valleys of the Nile and in the Ethiopian highlands, Africans independently domesticated crops: sorghum, millet, teff, African rice, yams. These weren't borrowed from the Middle East, they were African innovations, domesticated by African farmers who understood their land. And then, around 3100 BCE, something happened that would echo through millennia. Upper and Lower Egypt unified under a king named Narmer. The Egyptian civilization, one of the longest-lasting and most influential in human history, was born. For the next 3,000 years, Egypt would dominate the ancient world. Think about that timeline. 3,000 years. The Roman Empire lasted 500 years by comparison. When Cleopatra walked the halls of Alexandria, she lived closer in time to the moon landing than to the building of the Great Pyramids. The pyramids themselves are engineering marvels that still confuse experts today. The Great Pyramid of Khufu was the tallest building in the world for 3,800 years. It's made of 2.3 million stone blocks, some weighing up to 80 tons, fitted together with such precision that you can't slide a piece of paper between them. Ancient Egyptians built this without steel tools, without the wheel for transportation, without modern machinery. How? Through mathematics, astronomy, organization, and sheer human ingenuity. Egyptian medicine was so advanced that they performed surgery, set broken bones, and even had specialized doctors for different ailments. They created one of the world's first writing systems, hieroglyphs, preserving everything from royal decrees to love poetry. Egyptian women could own property, initiate divorce, and run businesses. In many ways, Egyptian women had more rights in 2000 BCE than European women would have in 1800 CE. But Egyptian wasn't alone. To the south, in what is now Sudan, the Kingdom of Kush rose to power around 1070 BCE. The Kushites weren't Egypt's little siblings, they were rivals, conquerors, innovators. The Kushite king Pi conquered Egypt itself in 727 BCE, founding the 25th dynasty. For nearly a century, black African pharaohs ruled over all of Egypt. When the Kushites were eventually pushed south by the Assyrians, they didn't fade away. They moved their capital to Meroe and created something unique. Meroe became one of the ancient world's great ironworking centers. They developed their own script, Meroic, which scholars are still working to fully decipher. They built more pyramids than Egypt, over 200 of them, steep and sharp against the desert sky. Now let's shift our gaze west, across the Sahara, to the Sahel, that strip of land between the desert and the forests. Here, something remarkable was brewing. Around 300 CE, the Ghana Empire emerged. Not the Ghana of today, but an empire centered in what is now Mali and Mauritania. The Ghana Empire controlled something everyone wanted: gold. The empire sat atop some of the richest gold deposits in the world, and they knew exactly how to leverage it. Ghana became fabulously wealthy through trade: gold from the south, salt from the Saharan mines in the north. Pound for pound, salt was sometimes worth as much as gold, because in the tropical heat, salt wasn't a luxury, it was survival. The king of Ghana was so wealthy that, according to the Arab historian al-Bakri, his horse wore a golden saddle and was tethered with a golden rope. But Ghana wasn't just wealthy, he was a patron of learning. He brought back architects from Mecca who built mosques across Mali, including the famous Dingareber Mosque in Timbuktu, which still stands today. Under his rule, Timbuktu became one of the world's great centers of learning, home to the University of Sankore. At its peak, Timbuktu held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on subjects from astronomy to mathematics to poetry. The manuscripts of Timbuktu, hundreds of thousands of them, survived, hidden in private collections, proving that Africa had a rich written tradition that colonizers claimed never existed. While empires rose and fell in West Africa, other civilizations flourished across the continent. In what is now Nigeria, the Nok culture was smelting iron as early as 1000 BCE. They created stunning terracotta sculptures, some of the most sophisticated art of the ancient world. The Nok people mastered iron technology independently at roughly the same time as the Middle East and before Europe. This iron technology spread across sub-Saharan Africa through the Bantu migrations, one of the great human movements in history. Over thousands of years, Bantu-speaking peoples spread from West Africa across Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa, bringing with them agriculture, ironworking, and new languages. They didn't conquer, they integrated, intermarried, shared knowledge. Today, over 300 million people speak Bantu languages. In East Africa, the Swahili coast flourished. Cities like Kilwa, Mombasa, and Zanzibar became cosmopolitan trading hubs connecting Africa with Arabia, Persia, India, and even China.
Swahili merchants traded gold, ivory, and slaves for Persian carpets, Chinese porcelain, and Indian textiles. The Swahili language itself, a beautiful blend of Bantu and Arabic, reflects this cultural crossroads. And then there's Great Zimbabwe. Built between the 11th and 15th centuries in what is now Zimbabwe, this was the capital of a vast kingdom. The stone walls of Great Zimbabwe, some 36 feet tall, built without mortar, housed up to 18,000 people at its peak. The kingdom controlled gold and ivory trade routes stretching to the coast. When European colonizers first saw Great Zimbabwe, they couldn't believe Africans had built it. They invented elaborate theories. Maybe it was built by Phoenicians or Arabs or the Queen of Sheba or even aliens, anyone but Africans. But the archaeology is clear.
Great Zimbabwe was built by the Shona people, and it stands as testament to African engineering and organization. In the forests of West Africa, powerful kingdoms emerged that would shape the region for centuries. The Yoruba kingdoms of what is now Nigeria developed sophisticated city-states. Ile-Ife, considered the spiritual homeland of the Yoruba people, was producing bronze and terracotta art by the 12th century that rivals anything from the Renaissance. The bronze heads of Ife are so lifelike, so technically perfect, that European art historians initially refused to believe Africans made them. The Kingdom of Benin, not to be confused with modern Benin, was at its height in the 15th and 16th centuries. The capital, Benin City, stunned European visitors. Dutch accounts from the 17th century describe Benin City as larger than Amsterdam, with wide, straight avenues, elaborate palaces, and sophisticated administrative systems. The Benin bronzes, thousands of brass plaques and sculptures, documented the kingdom's history and daily life with extraordinary artistic skill. The kingdom was so well organized that it had a professional army, a complex bureaucracy, and an extensive trade network. The Oba, or King of Benin, was an absolute monarch whose power was checked by a council of chiefs, a system of government that balanced authority with accountability. In 1897, the British looted Benin City, burning the palaces and stealing the Benin bronzes. These artifacts ended up in museums across Europe and America, where they remain to this day, despite calls for their return. The British destroyed a sophisticated African civilization and then used its absence as proof that Africans were uncivilized. So here's what they don't tell you in school. Africa isn't the continent that civilization forgot. Africa is where civilization began. From the first humans who painted caves and strung beads in South Africa, to the pharaohs who built monuments that would outlast empires, to the scholars of Timbuktu who preserved knowledge while Europe burned its libraries, to the artists of Benin who created masterpieces in bronze, African civilizations weren't primitive, they were pioneering. The story of African civilization isn't a footnote in human history, it's the first chapter. Everything else flows from here. And perhaps the greatest tragedy isn't just that these stories were forgotten, it's that they were deliberately erased. Because if people knew that Africans built pyramids, created universities, wrote hundreds of thousands of books, and governed vast, sophisticated empires, well, then the whole narrative of European supremacy falls apart, doesn't it? But the stones remain, the manuscripts survive, the DNA doesn't lie, and the truth, as it always does, endures. Africa didn't need to be civilized. Africa is civilization. And now you know.